My name is Jake. I'm 22 years old, and like many young people in New York, I was in a financial hole so deep it seemed impossible to climb out. After the sudden death of my father, my family's life turned into chaos. My mother, still grieving, does what she can, but supporting me and my younger sister is an impossible task with what she earns as a supermarket cashier. Desperate for money, I started looking for work everywhere. Then, during a sleepless night, scrolling through classified ads on my phone, I came across a peculiar listing. Nighttime taxi driver needed. Above average pay. Immediate start. I knew it sounded too good to be true, but the promise of a generous income was more tempting than my skepticism. There was a contact number, no email, no website, just a direct line. I called immediately. The call was answered by a man with a deep, slow voice. He introduced himself as Dom. His questions were direct but strangely specific. Are you afraid of driving at night? Have you ever seen things you can't explain? Are you good at following instructions? It wasn't the kind of interview I expected, but I answered everything without hesitation. When he finally said I was hired, I felt a wave of relief, though part of me felt uneasy. He told me to meet him at an abandoned parking lot in Queens to pick up the car and instructions. That night, my anxiety grew as I drove to the location. The parking lot was deserted and poorly lit. Dom was exactly what his voice suggested. Tall, thin, middle-aged, with a face worn by fatigue and time. He didn't greet me, just handed me the taxi keys and a thick envelope with a piece of paper inside. Read the rules. Follow them all, or you won't make it home. The way he spoke, emotionless and cold, sent chills down my spine. Before I could ask questions, he was gone, vanishing into the darkness. I got into the car. The smell of old leather and gasoline filled the air. I turned on the interior light, tore open the envelope, and found a list of rules. The paper was yellowed, as if it had been used many times before. The words were handwritten but with eerie precision. Reluctantly, I began to read. Rule number 1. If you receive a call from a number with only 3 digits, hang up immediately. Wait a few seconds, then call back and ask for the caller's location. Politely decline the ride, make up an excuse, and stay at least 300 feet away from the location for 2 hours. Warning: these people do not tolerate the presence of taxi drivers. Rule number 2. Never allow passengers to sit in the front seat. Once they're inside, check their reflection in the rearview mirror. If they have a reflection, proceed with the ride normally. They will pay as they wish at the end. If they do not have a reflection, take the gun from the glove box and eliminate them. This is an extreme but necessary measure for your survival. Rule number 3. Only vegetarian food is allowed in the car. The smell of meat can attract dangerous creatures that lurk around drivers. Rule number 4. If you receive a call from someone you know during your shift, do not answer. Whoever it is, it's not who you think they are. If you do answer, you will hear an ear-piercing scream that may cause permanent damage, such as ruptured eardrums. Rule number 5. Do not attempt to abandon the car at any time, especially on a road. Any attempt will result in a brutal and indescribable death. Rule number 6. You are required to work for the company for at least 2 months before considering quitting. This rule is irrevocable for reasons that cannot be explained. Rule number 7. If you see dark figures running alongside the car, accelerate to over 50 miles per hour and ignore them. Never stop or slow down. Driving on busy roads can also help keep them away. Rule number 8. If you smell rotting meat coming from the back seats, don't look back. Take the gun from the glove box, close your eyes, turn around, and fire toward the back seats. The smell will disappear, and the thing cannot harm you if you don't see it. Rule number 9. If the engine stalls, do not leave the car. Wait 20 to 30 minutes. It will restart on its own. Any attempt to leave the vehicle will be a fatal trap. Rule number 10. Never call anyone for help. Your contacts won't answer, and any attempt may anger the creatures around you. Additionally, a loved one may die naturally the following day as a consequence. Rule number 11. At 6 a.m., end your shift by driving the car home. Leave the keys in the vehicle and go about your day as usual. The car will disappear about an hour later and reappear in the same spot the next night. When I finished reading, I laughed nervously. This was obviously a joke, right? No one would put these absurd rules in a real job. Still, part of me knew something was off. I put the paper in the glove box, started the engine, and set out for my first night of work. The first ride of the night went smoothly, giving me a false sense of security. I had parked the taxi at a busy spot in Manhattan, and soon a man in a suit waved me down. He got in quickly, carrying a leather briefcase. To the Bronx, corner of East 138th and Willis. Can you be quick? I nodded and started driving, trying to keep my mind focused on the route instead of those damned rules. He was just a normal passenger, and I was beginning to believe Dom had played a prank on me with that ridiculous list. The man stayed on his phone the entire ride, talking about an important meeting. The normality of the situation calmed me down. When I dropped him off, he paid in cash, tipped generously, and left with a quick wave. Too easy, I thought, an involuntary smile creeping onto my face. I drove aimlessly for a few minutes, watching the empty streets of the city, when my phone started ringing. I glanced at the screen, and my heart froze. It was my mom. Shit, I muttered, remembering rule number 4. If you receive a call from someone you know during your shift, do not answer. Whoever it is, it's not who you think they are. The ringing continued, insistent, growing louder with each chime. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, almost sliding to answer, but I stopped. If those rules were real, and God knows I didn't want to find out, answering could be dangerous. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Not even 5 seconds passed before it started ringing again. My mom was desperately trying to call me, and it was killing me inside. Why was she so insistent? Had something happened to my sister? Suddenly, a nauseating smell filled the car. It was strong, acrid, like rotting meat left out in the sun for days. Panic consumed me as my stomach churned. I rolled up the windows, thinking it might be coming from outside, but the smell only intensified. That's when I realized it was coming from the back seats. My heart raced. Rule number 8. If you smell rotting meat coming from the back seats, do not look back. Take the gun from the glove box, close your eyes, turn around, and fire toward the back seats. My breathing grew heavy, and my hands started to tremble. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. I was alone in the car. I was sure of it, but the smell was there, growing stronger by the second, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. This is insane, I whispered to myself, my voice weak. I glanced at the glove box, my body frozen with fear. As absurd as it seemed, I knew I had 2 choices: obey or risk my life. My hand slowly reached for the glove box. When I opened it, there it was, a silver pistol, cold and heavy, almost as if it had been waiting for me. With my eyes tightly shut, I turned my body toward the back seats, trying to ignore the suffocating stench. Please, let there be nothing there, I whispered, almost like a prayer. I gripped the gun with both hands, pulled the trigger, and fired. The sound of the shot was deafening, echoing through the cab like an explosion. I fired again and again until the smell vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. Silence. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I sat frozen, breathing heavily, my face drenched in cold sweat. After what felt like hours but was only seconds, I opened my eyes. The car was empty. The back seats were intact, with no bullet holes or any sign that something had been there. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the gun still trembling in my hands. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or if I was on the verge of a mental breakdown. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 1:45 a.m. There was still a long time left before the shift ended. I put the gun back in the glove box, trying to steady my shaking hands. The list of rules was still there, folded neatly, mocking me. I didn't know what to expect from the next ride, but one thing was certain. This night was going to be much longer than I'd imagined. After the incident with the rotting meat smell, every minute in the cab felt like torture. The adrenaline from the earlier situation was still coursing through my veins, but I had to keep going. It was my first shift, and quitting wasn't an option. At 2:15 a.m., I got another request. The address was an old building in Queens. When I arrived, a woman was waiting outside, holding a small bag. She looked normal, wearing a beige coat with brown hair tied in a bun. She got into the back seat without a word. I checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. All good. Where to? I asked. Pine Hollow Farm, on the outskirts of the city. Pine Hollow Farm? I'd never heard of it. I checked the GPS. The place was in a remote area, far from any urban activity. It wasn't the kind of ride I wanted to take, but I didn't have the courage to refuse. She remained silent during the ride, staring out the window with a strange smile on her face. When we finally arrived, my discomfort grew. The farm was completely deserted, shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the taxi's headlights. "This is it?" I asked, hoping she would tell me I was in the wrong place. "Yes." She opened the door and stepped out with unsettling calm. Before I could ask anything else, I saw something that made me freeze. She walked up to the rusty gate and, with no apparent effort, climbed over the wall with inhuman agility. I sat there, paralyzed, watching as she disappeared into the darkness on the other side. Then I heard it. Strange sounds began coming from the farm. At first, it was the bleating of goats, guttural and desperate. Then something more disturbing, the sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my eyes stayed fixed on the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, I mustered the courage to hit the gas and leave that place behind. The drive back was long, but something had changed in me. I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, feeling as if something was following me. I was still trying to recover from the experience at the farm when my phone rang again. I looked at the screen mounted on the dashboard, and my heart nearly stopped. 3 digits. Only 3. The phone vibrated insistently, as if it knew I was afraid. Rule number 1. The words were clear in my mind. If you receive a call from a number with only 3 digits, hang up immediately. Wait a few seconds and call back, asking for the person's location. Politely decline the ride and stay at least 300 feet away from the location for 2 hours. With trembling hands, I hung up, but the phone rang again and again. It was as if it wouldn't take no for an answer. I swallowed hard and waited for the ringing to stop. When silence returned to the cab, I took a deep breath and dialed the number, following the rule. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A strange noise came from the other end. It wasn't static, but something wet, like dripping water. Then a voice spoke. It was low and slow, distorted, but eerily familiar. "At the end of the street. Please come get me." I knew I shouldn't, but my eyes instinctively darted to the end of the street I was on. The fog seemed thicker there, as if it was hiding something. "I'm sorry, but I won't be able to take this ride," I lied, trying to sound polite, as the rule instructed. There was a pause, too long to be normal. Then the voice responded. "They don't like that." The sound stopped, and the phone went dead. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and that's exactly what I did. I hit the gas, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. But that's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Dark figures. There were several of them, running alongside the taxi, their shapes hard to distinguish. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind, but their numbers kept growing. Some had long, disproportionate arms, others seemed to crawl, but all of them were chasing me. I immediately remembered rule number 7. If you see dark figures running alongside the car, accelerate to more than 50 miles per hour and ignore them. Never stop or slow down. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed quickly, but the figures didn't fall behind. On the contrary, they seemed faster, keeping up with the taxi effortlessly. The streetlights began to flicker, and something even more disturbing happened. The objects around the car started to change. Trash cans, parked cars. Even the trees looked like they were covered in a red liquid slowly dripping down. My brain refused to accept it, but it looked like blood. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The eyes of one of the figures glowed a vivid, intense red, and it was getting closer. Its form was becoming clearer now. Long claws, sharp teeth, but nothing I could describe as human. I pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing past 60 miles per hour, then 70, then 100, but the chase didn't stop. The figures began to surround the taxi, their shadows merging and blocking the view of the road ahead. Please, please, I whispered to no one in particular, my desperation overflowing. After what felt like endless minutes, everything stopped. The figures vanished. The streets around me returned to normal. No blood, no shadows, just the sound of the engine and my heavy breathing. I pulled over to the side of the road, unable to go on. My fingers were still gripping the steering wheel tightly, and my head throbbed. I was alive, but something inside me had shifted. The rules, as insane as they seemed, were real. Breaking them wasn't an option. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. There were still hours left until the shift ended. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. I had to keep going. There was no other choice. After the incident with the shadows, I did everything I could to stay focused. I repeated the rules in my head like a mantra, convincing myself that as long as I followed them, I'd be safe. But exhaustion and nerves were starting to take their toll. It was close to 3:45 a.m., and my stomach was growling. I hadn't eaten anything since lunch, and the constant fear was draining my energy. When I passed a fast food drive-thru, the temptation was too strong to resist. Just one burger, nothing more, I thought. I knew rule number 3. Only vegetarian food is allowed in the car. The smell of meat can attract dangerous creatures that lurk around drivers, but it seemed ridiculous. After everything I'd been through, a burger was the least of my problems, or so I thought. I parked the taxi on a quiet street, unwrapped the burger, and took a bite. The juicy meat felt like the best thing I'd eaten in months. My hunger was so overwhelming I completely ignored the small voice of caution in my head. That's when the taxi grew cold. Not a normal chill, but a bone-deep cold that seemed to come from within me, as if the air itself had been drained from the car. I looked around nervously but saw nothing at first. Then something caught my attention. The little hanging ornament on the rearview mirror started swinging on its own. Even though there was no wind or movement in the car, I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just paranoia, but then I heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A noise like distant growling, mixed with heavy, deep breathing. It seemed to come from everywhere. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. 2 glowing points, like eyes, stared at me from the darkness of the back seat. There was no body, just those eyes, fixed on me, analyzing my every move. Panic took over. I threw the burger out the window and tried to focus on the wheel, but the noises inside the car got worse. Objects began to shift. My phone fell from its holder. The paper with the rules flew out of the glove box and landed on the floor, as if something invisible was moving everything around. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," I murmured, my voice trembling. I tried to accelerate, but the car seemed to resist, as if something was holding it back. The eyes in the rearview mirror moved closer. Now they were more distinct, as if a form was starting to materialize around them. I remembered rule number 8. The The smell of meat can attract dangerous creatures that lurk around drivers. I didn't know what to do. The burger was already out of the car, but it didn't seem to be enough. I closed my eyes and began murmuring to myself, almost like a prayer. Then everything stopped. The eyes disappeared, the sounds ceased, and the car returned to normal. The cold dissipated, but the terror lingered. My entire body shook as I clutched the steering wheel. Finally, I picked the rules paper off the floor and put it back in the glove box. The warning was clear, and I had no excuses. These rules weren't exaggerations or pranks. They were my only line of defense against whatever was out there, or in the taxi. No matter how ridiculous it seemed, I realized then and there that I couldn't underestimate them again. This job wasn't normal. Nothing about it was. I spent the rest of the shift in complete silence, hungry and terrified. When the clock finally struck 6 a.m., I drove the taxi home, parking it where Dom had instructed. I stepped out and glanced at the car one last time before heading inside. I knew it would disappear soon, but the feeling that something was still watching me didn't leave. I would never eat inside that car again, especially not meat. After everything that had already happened, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But the truth is, this job always found a new way to remind me that I was completely wrong. The next night started off quietly. I started the taxi, repeated the rules to myself, and promised not to make the same mistakes. At 2 a.m., I received a request in a busy area of Manhattan. When I arrived at the address, an elegant man in a flawless suit, carrying a briefcase, was waiting on the sidewalk. He got into the back seat with a slight smile. "Good evening. To the Carlton Hotel, please." "Sure," I responded automatically. As soon as he shut the door, my hand instinctively went to the rearview mirror. By now, it was second nature to check the passengers. But what I saw, or rather what I didn't see, made my blood run cold. He had no reflection. The back seat appeared empty in the mirror, even though he was sitting right there. I tried to mask my nerves, but my hands were shaking. Rule number 2 echoed in my mind. If they do not have a reflection, take the gun from the glove box and eliminate them. This is an extreme but necessary measure for your survival. My mind raced. How was I supposed to do this without him noticing? He looked human, civilized, but the lack of a reflection proved he was nothing of the sort. "Is everything all right, driver?" he asked, his voice calm but now carrying an undercurrent of something threatening. "Yes, sir." My voice sounded strangely loud, betraying my fear. I slowly moved my hand toward the glove box, trying not to draw attention. But he was faster. Before I could even touch the gun, he leaned forward and grabbed my arm with a strength that didn't feel human. "So, you know what I am?" he said, smiling to reveal sharp, pointed teeth. My heart raced. He knew. Somehow he knew. I tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip, his hand as cold as ice. With his other hand, he grabbed the steering wheel and jerked it violently. The taxi veered off the road, nearly crashing into a pole. "You shouldn't have taken me as a passenger, Jake." My name. He knew my name. Panic consumed me. I struggled with all my might, kicking and pulling at my arm until I finally managed a brief moment of freedom. I grabbed the gun from the glove box and pointed it at him. "Get out of my car!" I shouted, my voice trembling with terror. He just laughed, a low, thunderous laugh that seemed to reverberate inside my head. "You think that's going to work?" I didn't wait to find out. I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit his shoulder, but instead of blood, a black smoke seeped from the wound. He screamed, but not in pain. It was more like a roar of anger, a sound so piercing it made my ears ring. He lunged at me, his cold hand reaching for my neck. I used the barrel of the gun to push him back as the car spun wildly down the deserted road. Finally, I summoned all the strength I had and fired 2 more shots. The black smoke filled the car, and the man let out a final scream before vanishing completely. It was as if he had never been there, except for the stench of sulfur that now permeated the taxi. I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, trembling from head to toe. I grabbed the paper with the rules from the glove box and stared at it as if it were the most sacred thing in the world. There was no doubt now. Those instructions were the only reason I was still alive. I wanted to quit, to abandon the car right there and never look back. But rule number 5 wouldn't let me forget. Do not attempt to abandon the car at any time. Any attempt will result in a brutal and indescribable death. The only choice was to keep going. I rested my head on the steering wheel for a few minutes, trying to regain control. Finally, I started the engine and got back on the road with a terrifying certainty. The night was far from over. After the encounter with the passenger with no reflection, I had the sinking feeling that things were only going to get worse. That night, every minute felt like an eternity, and the silence inside the taxi was almost deafening. I was driving through a more remote area of the city, deserted streets that felt like they existed in another world. There were no lights, no houses, just the narrow road and the dark trees surrounding it. The clock on the dashboard read 3:28 a.m. when it happened. Without warning, the taxi's engine started sputtering. The steering wheel grew heavier, and the car began to lose speed. "No, not now," I muttered, gripping the wheel as if that would fix the problem. The car came to a complete stop. All the lights on the dashboard went out, leaving me in total darkness. A chill ran down my spine as rule number 9 flooded my mind. If the engine fails, do not leave the car. Wait between 20 and 30 minutes. It will restart on its own. Any attempt to exit the vehicle will be a fatal trap. It was a rule I had read and dismissed as overly dramatic, but now, sitting in a dead taxi in the middle of nowhere, it felt more like a life or death warning. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing fear. I glanced at the clock, but it was dead. I pulled out my phone and started the timer. 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes. The first 5 minutes passed slowly. I forced myself to stare straight ahead, avoiding the rearview mirror or the windows. That's when I heard the first sound. Footsteps. They were light, almost delicate, as if someone were walking around the taxi. My heart raced, and my fingers gripped the wheel tighter. "It's just an animal," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But then the voices started. "Jake, why don't you come out?" The voice was familiar, and it took me a second to realize whose it was. My mother's. I swallowed hard, terror swelling in my chest. I knew it wasn't her. Couldn't be. Rule number 4 had already warned me about this. Familiar voices weren't real. "Are you okay, son?" The voice continued, now closer. I stared straight ahead, breathing deeply, refusing to respond. But then the voice changed. It became my sister's. "Jake, it's so dark out here. Why don't you open the door?" "I'm scared." My eyes began to burn from not blinking. The voices were so convincing, but I knew that giving in would mean my death. The footsteps continued, now heavier, as if several people were walking around the car. The body of the taxi began to creak, as though something were leaning against it, scratching the metal with claws or nails. I closed my eyes and started counting the minutes. 6, 7, 8. Then came the most horrifying sound of all. A knock on the driver's side window. It was loud and insistent, as if something were trying to force me to look. "Jake, it's Dad." "Open the door, son." I froze. The voice was identical to my father's. The same tone, the same cadence. Something I never thought I'd hear again. "I need to talk to you. Please." My vision blurred as tears streamed down my face. I wanted to believe it was him, more than anything in the world. But I knew. "Are you not coming out?" The voice roared, losing all gentleness and transforming into something monstrous. The knocking grew more violent, the footsteps around the car more frantic and erratic. The entire taxi began to shake, as if it were about to be flipped over. 13 minutes. Just 13 more minutes. The voices blended together, now a cacophony of screams and whispers coming from every direction. The windows were covered in handprints, some small, others massive. I curled up in the driver's seat, clutching the paper with the rules like it was my only anchor. My entire body trembled, and my breathing was ragged. Then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The voices stopped. Silence returned. I glanced at the time on my phone. 30 minutes. The taxi's engine roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I shifted gears with trembling hands and drove off as fast as I could, leaving that deserted road behind. I knew I would never forget that half hour, and I knew the only thing that kept me alive was the rule. Leaving the car wasn't an option. It never would be. The next night, my body felt drained, as if the tension from the last few shifts had sucked all the energy out of me. The memory of the voices, the eyes in the rearview mirror, and the shadows was still fresh. I didn't want to get back in that taxi, but I knew I had no choice. The rules were clear. 2 months. Shortly before 9 p.m., as I was getting ready to leave, my phone rang. The number was unknown, but I knew who it was before I even answered. "How's the job going, Jake?" said Dom, his deep voice sounding almost casual, as if we were discussing the weather. "Surviving," I replied. He laughed, a dry, curt sound that made me grip the phone tightly. "I know the job can be intense, but there's an opportunity for you." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "We have special runs, Jake. They're not for everyone. Only for those who've proven they can handle what happens at night." "Special?" I asked hesitantly. "Yes, they pay double. More than enough to take care of your financial troubles." "I know you need the money." Of course, Dom knew. He always seemed to know more about me than anyone should. "What do I have to do?" I asked cautiously. "Nothing you're not already doing. Just take the rides marked with the gold icon on the app. But a warning, Jake. These rides are different. More dangerous. Different how? You'll see." Before I could press him for details, the call ended. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, resisting the urge to throw it against the wall. But Dom was right. I needed the money. My mother and sister needed it. When I started my shift that night, it didn't take long for the first special ride to appear on the app. The pickup location had a gold icon next to it. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I accepted. "God help me," I muttered. The address was in an isolated part of Staten Island. When I arrived, no one was waiting, just a thick fog blanketing the street. Before I could start questioning whether I was in the right place, something emerged from the mist. It was a woman, or at least it seemed to be. Her movements were stiff, almost robotic, and she wore a white dress that looked wet. She got into the back seat without saying a word. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She handed me a piece of paper. On it was an address and the words, "Drive fast," written in shaky handwriting. I shifted into gear and started driving, the air in the taxi growing heavier with each passing mile. The woman didn't speak, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, avoiding the temptation to check her reflection in the mirror. The address led me to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. When we arrived, she got out of the car without a word, but something was left behind on the back seat. A small black bag. "Hey!" I called, but she had already vanished into the darkness. Before I could decide what to do, I heard a noise coming from the bag. Something moving, scratching, as if it were alive. Rule number 8, about not looking back if something strange happened, echoed in my mind, but this time it felt different. Couldn't resist. I opened the bag, and what I saw made my stomach churn. Inside was a hand. Just a hand, still moving, as if it were trying to escape. What the hell is this? Before I could think about getting rid of it, the hand leapt out of the bag, clinging to the passenger seat and scratching the leather. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. I grabbed the gun from the glove box and fired. The hand fell limp, but the entire taxi began to shake. The engine roared to life on its own, and the car lunged forward as if it had a mind of its own. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to maintain control as the taxi sped out of control. The factory around me seemed to warp, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. Finally, the car came to a sudden stop, throwing me against the steering wheel. When I looked back, the hand was gone. The bag was empty. That was just the first special ride. The money appeared in my account shortly after, double as Dom had promised. But as I drove back to the city, adrenaline still coursing through my veins, one thing became clear. I had agreed to something far bigger than I could handle. My body was still tense from the special ride. The memory of the hand in the bag, the factory, and the car seemingly coming to life haunted me. But there was something different about the taxi that night, an invisible weight, as if the car itself was waiting for something. As I adjusted the rearview mirror, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A thick yellow envelope, held to the edge of the glove box by a worn elastic band. My hands hesitated before picking it up. The envelope had no name or address, just the taxi company's symbol, a black triangle inside a circle. I opened it carefully, revealing a stack of papers, photos, and newspaper clippings. The smell of old paper filled the car. The first page had a name written in bold, handwritten letters. Dominic Halloway. My heart raced. Dom had always been a mystery. All I knew was that he was in charge, but nothing beyond that. Now, I was holding a fragment of his story, and something told me I wouldn't like what I was about to uncover. The following pages contained detailed reports of accidents and disappearances involving company drivers. Blurry photos showed terrified faces, some of them clearly deformed by something beyond human comprehension. One report caught my eye. It was from 1997 and described a driver named Peter Garrison. The text was short but chilling. Driver disobeyed the rules. Attempt to abandon vehicle recorded. Outcome: death confirmed. Note: taxi returned without driver. Vehicle cleaned and reintegrated into fleet. Then I found a photo of Dom. He looked younger, perhaps in his early 30s, but his vacant stare was the same. Next to him stood an older man in a black suit, with a smile that sent a chill down my spine. On the back of the photo was a rushed handwritten note. Dominic Halloway, intermediary. Agreement initiated in 1986. Entities satisfied. Intermediary. The word lingered in my mind as I continued to read. Other pages revealed something even more sinister. The company wasn't just a nighttime taxi service, but a bridge between our world and something beyond. The rides weren't just for humans, many were for entities. The rules, I realized, were a form of protection. They had been created based on the experiences of other drivers, those who had learned the hard way that following the instructions was the only way to survive. One name appeared repeatedly in the documents. The passengers, they weren't described in detail, but the implications were clear. These entities were the true clients of the company, and the drivers were nothing more than pawns, guided by Dom to ensure the rides were completed. I turned another page and found a handwritten note. The letters were firm, but there was something chaotic about the way the words were laid out. Jake, you weren't chosen by chance. Everyone has a role to play. Some serve, others pay the price. The note was signed with just the letter D. I shut the envelope and tossed it back into the glove box, my hands trembling. My breathing was heavy, and my mind spun with the implications of what I had just uncovered. Dom wasn't just my boss. He was a mediator between the human world and something darker, something I could barely begin to comprehend. And I was caught in the middle of it, a rookie with no idea how to escape. That night, as I drove through the city, the rules felt even more crucial. Every letter, every word was a fragile barrier against whatever awaited me on the other side. The silence in the taxi that night was almost unbearable. I dealt with so much since I started this job, but nothing could prepare me for the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The first ride of the night was eerily uneventful. A middle-aged man traveled from Brooklyn to Manhattan without saying a word. When he got out, I felt a brief sense of relief, but it didn't last long. The phone rang. I automatically checked the number, as I always did. It was a regular number, nothing unusual or threatening. I exhaled, relieved, and answered in the steadiest voice I could manage. "Taxi, where can I pick you up?" The response came instantly, and my blood ran cold. "Jake, it's me, son." I recognized the voice immediately. It was impossible not to. It was my father. My throat went dry, and a chill ran down my spine. He had been dead for almost a year, but the voice was identical. The warm tone, the gentle cadence, exactly as I remembered. I remembered rule number 4. If you receive a call from someone you know during your shift, do not answer. Whoever it is, it's not who you think they are. But I had already answered. "Jake, are you there?" The voice was filled with emotion, which only made it more unsettling. My hand tightened around the wheel as I tried to block it out. "You need to listen to me, son. I don't have much time, but I need your help." My heart pounded. It was a trick. I knew it was, but his words were unraveling me from the inside. "It's not real," I whispered to myself. The call ended abruptly, and the taxi was silent again. I tried to focus. I started the engine and began driving, thinking the worst was over. But then a new ride request appeared on the app. The destination, a residential neighborhood that looked all too familiar. I accepted it automatically without thinking. When I arrived at the address, a man was waiting outside an old house. My vision blurred. I blinked several times, hoping it was a trick of my mind, but it wasn't. It was my father. He was dressed exactly as he had been the last time I saw him, wearing the same worn leather jacket and faded cap. He waved at me like everything was perfectly normal and got into the back seat. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the rearview mirror. There he was, reflected like any other passenger. "Where to?" I managed to ask, my voice faltering. "Just drive, Jake. I'll tell you when we get there." The silence that followed was crushing. Every second felt like an eternity as I stared straight ahead, trying to avoid looking directly at him. "You've been working hard, haven't you?" he said, breaking the silence. His voice had that comforting tone that always made me feel safe as a child. Who are you?" I asked, my throat dry. "It's me, son. You know it's me. You can't be him. My father is dead." The man let out a low, almost melancholic laugh. "Sometimes, things aren't that simple, Jake." The taxi felt colder now, the air heavier, as if something invisible was pressing down on my chest. Finally, he pointed toward an empty street. "Stop here." I pulled over, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He opened the door, but before getting out, he leaned forward until his face was inches from mine. "Remember this, son. Not everything you see is what it seems." And then he was gone. He didn't step out of the car. He didn't open the door. He simply wasn't there anymore. I sat there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart raced, and my mind was in chaos. 2 months, 60 nights of terror, nerves of steel, and relentless tension. I had survived the job by following the rules to the letter, each one etched into my mind as a code of survival. There was no room for error. Every ride was a battle between reason and fear, between my humanity and the unknown. That night, the last of my contract, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the wheel. The taxi felt heavier, as if it had become an extension of me. Every scratch on the dashboard, every mark on the seat, was a reminder of the things I had faced. The clock read 11:59 p.m. When the hand struck midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a message. "Jake, we meet at 6. Dom." My breathing grew heavy. Of course Dom would show up. He was always one step ahead. always knowing when and how to find me. The last night started like any other. I accepted regular rides, avoided eating in the car, and checked the passengers' reflections. Each rule I followed was a shield against death or something worse. But as the hours passed, one persistent thought began to grow in my mind. What would I do after this? My mother was still struggling to pay the bills. My sister needed money for college. If I left this job, it would be impossible to find anything that paid this well. But continuing, damn it, I muttered to myself, pounding my fist against the steering wheel. At 5:45 a.m., I parked in an empty lot, waiting for Dom. The horizon was beginning to brighten with the first rays of sunlight. He appeared promptly at 6, emerging from the shadows like a living phantom. The same rumpled suit, the same tired face. "Congratulations, Jake," he said, leaning against the taxi. "You survived." "Barely," I replied, my voice rough with anger and exhaustion. Dom chuckled softly, a dry, hollow sound. "That's what they all say. Why me? Why all of this?" I demanded, glaring at him. He sighed, pulling a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. The smoke seemed to blend with the morning mist. "This job isn't just about money, Jake. It's a test, a filter. There are things in this world you'd never understand. Entities that require balance, mediation. People like you help keep it in check." "People like me?" I shot back. "People who have something to lose," he said, taking a long drag. "You do this for your family, and that's what makes you perfect." He was right. Every decision I'd made, every rule I'd followed, was for them. Dom leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "Now comes the decision, Jake. You can leave, take what you've earned and try to start over. Or you can stay. We'll double your pay, and you'll have all the support you need to protect your family. But know this, the longer you stay, the closer you get to losing something. Your sanity, maybe your soul." My chest tightened. My mind spun in circles, wrestling with the implications of his words. I could walk away and risk putting my family in trouble again. Or I could stay and become something worse than I already was. I looked at the taxi's steering wheel, my hands gripping it tightly. This car had become a prison, but also a salvation. "I'll stay," I said. Dom smiled, a cold, almost proud smile. He stepped back, dropping his cigarette to the ground and crushing it with his shoe. "I knew you would." He extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, I shook it. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm. "Welcome back, Jake. You know what to do." Dom disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with the taxi. I started the engine, and it purred like a beast awakening. The familiar sense of unease washed over me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. As I drove through New York's still sleeping streets, one thing became clear. This job wasn't just a means to an end. It was a sacrifice, a pact I was willing to make. I would drive night after night, facing whatever came my way. My sanity, my safety, none of it mattered, because in the end, everything I did was for them. The city never sleeps, and now neither would I. And if you plan to work as a nighttime taxi driver in New York, read the rules.